We have run this policy brief initiative and we've had a fantastic response to it since we had put out the call for applications back in January. The scheme was led by our excellent knowledge exchange officer, Karen Mabon, and essentially what the scheme has done is create an opportunity for 6 early career researchers to translate their PhD thesis into an accessible policy brief, which is then professionally designed and hosted on the SCCJR website. All of the successful applicants who are with us today presenting were also given training around working towards a policy brief. I think writing a policy brief is quite different to writing a 90,000 odd word thesis, and translating something of that magnitude into a few short pages is quite a challenge, I think. So they received training around that, and they were also matched up with a mentor within SCCJR to provide further support. So I also want to acknowledge the mentors, all 6 mentors who participated in the scheme, not just for their work in supporting the researchers, but actually just how quickly and readily they actually agreed to support and participate in the scheme, which I think is very characteristic of the collegiate nature of relationships within SCCJR. As I also mentioned, the scheme was led by Karen Mabon. She has done some excellent work here, and the scheme wouldn't have come to fruition without her. We wouldn't be here today without the excellent work that Karen has done. So I want to say thanks to Karen for that as well. So in terms of the session this morning, the format will be that each of the researchers will present for around 10 minutes, and then after that we'll have time for discussion. We've got 5 presenters this morning rather than the full 6, since unfortunately Andrea couldn't be with us due to a prior commitment. So really looking forward to hearing the presentations, as I'm sure you all are. So without much further ado, I'll turn over to our first presenter, and I believe the running order is in the chat. So our first presenter is Emily Quibis-Bowdry, who did her PhD on violence in men's prisons based at Edinburgh University, and she was mentored by Katrina Morrison from Edinburgh Napier. So over to you, Emily.
Thanks for the introduction, Una. So I will cover my research and the policy brief today, which was on video research into prison violence. I'll start by talking about my research and key points from the brief, including the recommendations, and then I'll reflect on the process of writing the brief and some key learning points. So I'll start by briefly outlining my doctoral research, which of course the policy brief builds on. So a lot has been written about the reasons why we see rising levels of violence in Scottish prisons, including overcrowding, poor staff retention, and outdated architecture, leading to poor conditions for both prisoners and staff. And whilst these are useful in understanding why violence happens, my research looked into how violence happens and examined the uses of video data in understanding prison violence. So I combined video footage showing violent situations from UK and US prisons from YouTube because unfortunately COVID prevented me from seeking access to CCTV footage through the Scottish Prison Service. So I combined video footage with focus group interviews with prison officers and previously imprisoned people in Scotland. And the focus groups viewed the clips that I had used in my video analysis to test my interpretation of the violent situations and to discuss dynamics of escalation and de-escalation. My research looked at both prisoner on prisoner violence and violence involving prison officers. But as my research showed potential for video enhanced prison officer training, that's the aspect that I'll be focusing on today, which was also focused on in the policy brief. And so before I go into the use of video and violence prevention, I will briefly go over some of the key findings from my research. So prison officers, or the video analysis showed that prison officers who show that they are fearful, that could be shown through struggling to control their bodily movements, like stumbling over their feet, for example, tend to lose momentum of conflict situations, which can lead to prisoners becoming violent and using violence against officers, and that sort of allows the prisoners to take control of the situation. Equally, displays of anger by officers, that could be shouting, giving orders, or invading personal space, provoke prisoner aggression and can push conflict to become violent. So paying attention to the type of fights between prisoners can help steer intervention. For example, where prisoners are cheering each other on to fight, the energy or the mood will be higher. And so those who are involved in these fights are caught up in the moment, so to speak, which can make it more difficult to de-escalate. Karen, you can move to the next slide. So I'll move on to the uses of video footage for prison officer training. Whilst work is being done to combat issues like overcrowding and poor staff retention, these solutions take time, and that means that there is a need for intervention with a quicker implementation time, and that is essentially what my brief proposes through the use of video footage to inform prison officer or violence prevention minimization training. Video footage makes it possible to look at how interactions unfold and how displays of different emotions impact the course of interaction. And this means that video data can be used to map the patterns of escalation and de-escalation, which can then form the basis for useful discussions about how to manage violent conflict, or conflict before it turns violent. Equally, video studies can be applied to specific types of interactions or specific areas of the prison to understand localized dynamics. So all in all, video studies can be tailored to focus on either escalation or de-escalation to understand which practices are helpful in preventing or minimizing violence, and which are not. In this way, video data has the potential to bring together practice and theory to further develop prison officer training. And so the overall recommendation is to implement this video-informed aspect into prison officer training. And to implement this, I propose that training material is developed through co-viewing methods with prison officers. And this means that video footage is viewed together with experienced officers to discuss de-escalation practices, how they are practiced in real life, which can then inform future best practice. And this, of course, requires a pilot project where the use of CCTV from relevant institution is analyzed, and this should also involve an evaluation of implemented practices which are developed through or during the pilot training material. A video-informed framework should also be used in foundation training to show new officers what real-life intervention looks like, as well as how different escalatory and conciliatory practices impact the course of conflict and violence. And lastly, as debriefing practices already involve video, but these should be supplemented by a clear co-viewing framework. So that about covers the key points from the policy brief. So I'll move on to the process of writing the brief and some key learning points. And you can, yes, thank you. I think one of the main challenges, as Una was touching on before, was trying to condense this 200-page thesis document into 5 or 6 pages. And whilst the general theme of the brief was quite clear, it was difficult to decide what should be included and what should be left out. You spend several years being told to expand your explanations and to make sure that your argument is fully explained in as much detail as possible to essentially convince people of your argument. With a policy brief, you have to do the same thing, but with so little detail. So you really need to consider what is the core part of the argument and what key information do I need to highlight for it to make sense. And that in itself can also be a bit of a challenge. because you worked X number of years on a project and you're so into it that you may leave out certain steps that make your argument or explanation incoherent. And so I found it quite helpful to have other eyes on it, whether this was the mentor or colleagues. And I think one of the things that I was often told during the PhD was the importance of outlining my method in detail because it isn't traditional. And so my initial drafts of the brief also had a lot of information outlining the method. And then I focused on boiling that down to bullet points to sort of complement the solution section of the brief. As for key learning point, I think I realized that I shouldn't be explaining why this is useful research, why this is a useful research method, but rather how I use the method to find out something useful with real life value. This is potentially most relatable for people who are finishing a PhD or who've just finished. But the brief helped me with a bit of a shift in or a way of thinking from explaining like this really long research process to explaining a final research project and product and drawing out its essence. So I think potentially the question I ended up asking myself was, what did I find out and why is it useful? And then I sort of added on to that the information I needed to explain the context of the issue, so to speak, and the core parts of what the video methodology offers. And through the mentor feedback, it was also cemented what needed to go into the brief, not just in terms of information, but also how things should be framed, considering the intended audience, and what could be left out, like long methodological explanations, and that also helped to structure the brief. And you can move to the last slide. So to round off, one of the most enjoyable parts of the policy brief process was being paired with an academic in a similar field, the wonderful Katrina Morrison, who had some insight into my research, but who wasn't a supervisor during the PhD, and through feedback, which was really useful, also getting a sense of what outsiders see as important or useful in terms of what stands out from my research. And I think that's something we tend to forget in the research process. I think that was all for me, so thank you for listening.
Thanks, Emily. That was fantastic. Such an interesting piece of work and really interesting reflections that I absolutely recognise as well. As I mentioned earlier, we will have time for questions and discussion at the end. So if you do have any questions coming up during the presentations, just make a note of them and you can pop them in the chat later or just raise a hand. But for now, we'll move on to our next presenter, Jay, who will be talking about his work on the police adoption of body-worn video technology in England and Wales. Jay was supervised jointly between Edinburgh and Glasgow and mentored by Kelly Johnson in Glasgow. Over to you, Jay.
I think. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay. My policy brief examines the production and interpretation of body-worn video. My doctoral research examined the ways in which police in England and Wales and body-worn video technology shaped one another. One of the core sort of ideas which came out of that doctoral research for me was the misalignment of vendor claims and assumptions by users, which in this case is police organizations, and the technical realities and technical and operational realities. And for me, that was actually rather a big finding. And one of the core assumptions and claims was that this body-worn video footage is somehow neutral, independent, and an objective record that can sort of speak for itself, and that it's got its own perspective and it's outside of the police network. And one of the core findings was actually that police are extremely central to the operation of the system, the selection of the system, the procurement of the system, the control and the access of the system. And that is a through line which I wanted to bring into this policy brief, is that how footage is actually produced by the police, and how it is actually shaped through organizational processes as well as interpretive processes which are more individual. For me, the core tenets on this, why this matters, I always bring it down back to police transparency and accountability. So I didn't specifically focus on video footage in my doctoral research. It was only one of the defining chapters, and it was actually a way of using a conceptual toolkit which I had developed drawing from other disciplines such as applied ergonomics and cognitive science. So for me, this was actually a very interesting opportunity to sort of pick on a different through line and interrogate other findings that came out of my doctoral research. In terms of future proofing, there's a very interesting tendency that in order for there to be, if there's any sort of technological issue or problem, there's a tendency to fix that problem with further technology. And this is, for me, is something which I wanted to address while also being very strategic with the policy briefing. While the policy briefing is about dissemination and communication, it's also about, for me, how do I use this strategically to think about where I want my career trajectory or research trajectory to go. And in this case, it's something I addressed in section 5.2 on emergent technology, sort of drone technology and computerized assessment or AI-assisted assessment of police footage, which actually brings me then on to the process itself. How did I want to write this policy briefing? And to echo a lot of Emily's sentiments and what she covered, this was a very challenging process in terms of we've been trained for the past couple of years to sort of over-explain things, to reference heavily. Our theses are full of parentheses, commas, end dashes, brackets everywhere, and citations, and it was a very interesting process to try and unravel that and think differently and change it for a different audience. So for me, I leaned quite heavily into this. As you can see from the front page of my policy briefing, I decided to design it and front load this, thinking about if somebody has 5 minutes, can they get the gist of the message, or actually a bit more than the gist of the message, but can they understand what I'm trying to communicate here, which is kind of addressing these claims and assumptions. So I decided not to have a cover page. I went with the executive summary and the key points. I also leaned very heavily into use of headings and diagrams, so that if somebody literally just went through my policy briefing and only just read the headings, they would actually be able to follow my arguments. And the recommendations themselves also have very short headings, so that if somebody reads the heading and they're interested, then they can read more about it. But if they don't, then they actually get a sense, and I've managed to then communicate my message. In terms of style, once again, I leaned into this with the audience. It was very strange for me. I decided not to include citations in the policy briefing itself, which then was a challenge for me, because then how do I communicate this with word choice and register to show what is my work, what is other people's work, and then also to think about communicating my research, but also thinking about the implications, the future implications of police technology adoption, and then specifically what can I reasonably infer from my findings, and then how can I communicate that through word choice. So saying things like this might happen or is likely to happen in the future. So for me, this was a very challenging and educational process. So yeah, it was all about claims and synthesis. What is my work? What is other people's work? And how do I communicate that without creating sort of delving off into speculative futures. On receiving feedback, absolutely a necessary component of this, and I'm so thankful for it. Kelly was great. When I originally outlined this a policy briefing, I was very contained in that I wanted to focus on the Scottish context. I wanted to engage quite a bit with something which was idiosyncratic to the Scottish context, which was the corroboration rule and how this might, the implications of that on the corroboration rule. But her feedback was, Jay, why don't you broaden this, make it more generalizable to other audiences, which for me actually gave me the permission to then really think about what do I think is important and worth communicating to a broader audience, which was really, it was like taking the shackles off. And in terms of then, once I had delivered the draft, it was very important getting that feedback. Okay, I had these aims of what I wanted to do, but where had I fallen short in terms of kind of achieving those goals? Where wasn't I communicating properly? Where was I maybe leaning a little bit too heavily into speculative claims, things like that. So the process, phenomenal. I'd recommend it to current PhDs or PhDs going out. But sorry, just to touch back, future-proofing is just such an important component of it. Use this opportunity as not just communication and dissemination, but also about thinking about your next steps in your career, whether that's postdoc or going into leaving academia or staying in academia, whatever you want to do, but then leaning on something that you can kind of link to the next step. So that's me. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Jay. Again, just such an interesting topic and really helpful, I think, to unearth the assumption that body-worn video kind of footage is somehow neutral or independent. Certainly in work that I've conducted with colleagues, it really stands out that this kind of evidence is seen as some kind of gold standard. So unearthing that assumption, I think, is really important. Yeah, and some fantastic reflections on the process and tips that I'm writing down. For example, using the headings to be able to just see what the message is straight away. I think that's a great tip. So I'm noting them all down. Thank you. So yeah, so on to our next presenter, Jeanne Dooley, who will be speaking about her work on a feminist media analysis of the Shamima Begum case. Jeanne was supervised in Glasgow, and she was mentored by Milena Tripkovich from Edinburgh. Over to you, Jeanne.
Thank you so much, Una. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeanne. My policy brief is on, as you can see, media narratives, the nationalization and counterterrorism policy, the lessons we can take from the Shamima Begum case. My PhD was newspaper media analysis of the coverage of the Shamima Begum story between the years of 2015 and 2023. The policy brief obviously is based on this research, and it's an examination of how media narratives shaped public understandings of specifically citizenship deprivation in the UK, and how those narratives have contributed to making the nationalization an acceptable or legitimate counterterrorism response. Very briefly, for those who don't know, I believe almost everyone would know here, but Shamima Begum was a British Muslim 15-year-old girl in 2015 who was living in East London and subsequently left the UK with two of her friends to join the Islamic State in Syria. She was found 4 years later in 2019 in a refugee camp in Syria again. And she was 9 months pregnant, and she begged to come back to the UK. Instead, the then government deprived her of her citizenship and left her stateless in a refugee camp in Syria. She appealed many times, and she is unfortunately still stateless to this day, still in a refugee camp today. My PhD research covered not whether Shamima is a terrorist or not, but rather what were the media narratives around her and how they were depicting her. So the main findings from this that Shamima were that Shamima was simultaneously framed as a victim, a vulnerable girl, a monstrous threat to the UK, an othered figure, and a conflicted woman. And what was interesting in her coverage and what I focused on in this brief was that she's not only depicted in the media as someone who's accused of terrorism, but she's also depicted a lot, and the research demonstrates this, as someone who lost her right to belong to the UK. And she, to me, is a great example of the power of media reporting in actively shaping public understanding of societal issues with the power of media framing. So a lot of different tools, if I may, were used by the media to frame her story, including, for instance, sensationalist language, emotive language, provoking emotions within the reader. Despite the fact that I studied broadsheets and not tabloids for the PhD, which was interesting, rather than focusing on more legal principles, she was there was a whole dichotomy of victimhood and threat with very little contextualization of her story. There were also a lot of racialized narratives surrounding her and surrounding British Muslim identity specifically, and women specifically, Muslims in Britain, which pointed out to the question of is Shamima being truly British or not, and led to the question of citizenship being seen as conditional rather than a human right. So that is the crucial point which I focused on for this brief, is citizenship was framed regarding to moral worth and not and seen, as I said, as conditional and not a right, which means that the nationalization becomes, in this case, an easy counterterrorism response, because the government, when they deprived her of her citizenship, really claims that it was a matter of national security, but there was no proof of anything publicly. But this really went on to be reprised by the media a lot, and it becomes, the nationalization then becomes an easy response rather than an exceptional measure. So this is what I wanted to focus on in this brief, is to highlight why responsible reporting matters, because without it, there are a lot of issues which would rise. For instance, the reinforcing discrimination, undermining human rights principles such as the right of citizenship, distorting some public understanding of one's story, and then influencing policy environments. So I recommend in the brief for the media specifically more specific guidance for the terrorism related cases, for reporting on those cases. Encouraging more intersectional reporting standards, because this was one of the main findings, the lack of intersectionality in intersectional reporting, because this is a story of gender, race, age, and not just one or the other. And placing greater emphasis on legal and then political context rather than emotional or sensational narratives, no matter how thrilling they may be, no matter how interesting they may be to the reader. I believe that those can be regulated. And then for policymakers, I would argue that citizenship decisions should be protected from media-driven political pressures. Perhaps that media literacy could be strengthened, and that the broader social impact of citizenship deprivation should really be reviewed, and particularly in relation to social cohesion and belonging. In terms of the process of making the brief, I would agree 100% with Jay and Emily. It was a challenging exercise in that we are not trained to write a policy brief at all when we write a thesis. I think the most challenging for me was the aim, especially because I have an intersectional research, so to not speak to everybody, because in an ideal world I would speak to an organization because my research touches on feminist criminology as well, so I was interested in that as well. But you have to focus on a particular aim and write very differently than you would write, as Jay said, no reference or very little referencing, or differently than you would do in a PhD, because everything has to be demonstrated and explained in great detail in a PhD, and this is more about being concise, choosing your aim, your audience 100%, summarizing in a different way. And yeah, I think mostly having a different perspective in thinking. So along a PhD, we're taught to always think about, what did my research show? What did my research discover? Why is this research important? And here it's more of on the practical side of, why does this matter technically for policy and for decision makers? And it seems like an easy exercise. It's not as easy as it seems, I think. So I would, also very highly recommend the exercise. And I think it's an excellent exercise for those finishing the PhD or towards finishing the PhD, because it also makes you think about what you want your research to mean in the future. So thank you to everyone for this opportunity. And yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks so much. Gosh, I was really taken aback when you mentioned how long ago this case first came to prominence, which I think just shows what, I guess sort of like powerful but concerning case it was. And I think, it kind of resonates, and it still resonates, I think, because of the range of different issues that it brought to life. And you mentioned those right there, but I can only imagine that made it quite challenging in terms of distilling that into a policy brief, because there are so many kind of themes and issues that arose from that particular case. But that was fascinating. Thank you. So on to our next speaker, Nicola Cizi. So Nicola is joining us from Romania today, but her PhD was jointly supervised in Glasgow and Edinburgh. It focused on OLRs, or Orders for Lifelong Restriction, in Scotland, and she was mentored by Marguerite Schinkel from Glasgow University. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you so much, Una, for the introduction. The worst thing about going forth is that you realise all the things that you wanted to say that you didn't say when you wrote your presentation. So that's perfect. Let me try to, I'll talk a little bit about the policy briefing and the process. So can we skip to next, please? Yep, so the title of my thesis is, as you can see, Labour in the Shadows, Hope, Fear and Bureaucratic Harms in Navigating Risk with Dangerous People. And essentially, it's an examination of Scotland's Order for Lifelong Restriction. If you skip to the next slide, I'll read out some facts. So I hope you guys can see that. It's a wee bit wee, but I'll try my best from here. So the OLR was introduced in 2006 following the Maclean Committee's review of the provisions for the sentencing and management of serious violent and sexual offenders. It was intended as an exceptional sentence for an exceptional offender. And that person was somebody that is thought to be at the point of sentencing, following assessment of medium or high risk, to be requiring lifelong control. It is a risk-based indeterminate sentence with both a custodial and, at least theoretically, a community-based element. And it's one of 3 forms of life sentencing available to the Scottish courts. And I'm happy to explain that for any interested parties. The OLR is a sentence that endures for life, so it truly is a lifelong sentence, and it doesn't preclude preclude the possibility that a person might die in prison, as we have seen. Can we skip to the next slide, please? So there are currently 305, well, of last count, there was 305 OLRs introduced or issued by the Scottish courts since 2006. If we skip to next. So why even look at the order for lifelong restriction? If you skip to the next slide, please. So as it stands, there are 92% of persons who have an order for lifelong restriction who are in prison beyond the punishment part of that sentence. And what that really means is that once you are given an order for lifelong restriction, the burden of responsibility is placed on you to prove essentially that you're no longer a risk to the public. And that creates its own difficulties with navigating prison systems. If you skip to the next slide, please. Okay, so my research question, there was essentially 3 elements to the research question, and the first 2 parts were really very straightforward, and it went like, so what is the order for lifelong restriction? What does it do and who is it for? And the more substantial element of the research was to understand how the order for lifelong restriction is experienced by those responsible for sentencing, for managing and for caring for those, usually in a custodial sentence, to those subject to it. It was a qualitative study, and it involved semi-structured interviews with 22 criminal justice professionals, and you can see the list of professionals there in this slide. If you could just skip to next for me, please. So in terms of the findings, so the overall findings suggest that while the order for lifelong restriction was introduced to mitigate risks, it actually generates administrative, ethical and emotional burdens, risks and harms for both practitioners and through practitioner accounts for those subject to the sentence. If we could just skip to next again, please. So the task for me, after working so hard and so long on the development of my doctoral thesis, was very much, you know, in par with what what the other participants have said. And it's how do you translate something so big and so theoretically dense into something that's translatable into policy or into policy recommendations. So I'm just struggling to see what I've got on my slides here, sorry. Yeah, I think I've covered it. Can we just skip to the next, please? That's perfect. So what I sought to do here was to give you a kind of visual of the process and try to convey the complexity of, I don't want to say reducing, but I'm going to say reducing the kind of theoretical focus into a kind of evidence that can be used for recommendations. So my chapter 5 was kind of set the findings of the thesis, and essentially it was about how systems of control try to identify and henceforth isolate dangerous people, and me asking who are these people that require to be subject to those exceptional measures. And it shows how the MacLean Committee set up a kind of Proteus-like subject, so from Greek mythology, a shapeshifter, someone who is apparently elusive, contradictory, and difficult to define, and who was variously imagined by my research participants in ways such as extremely dangerous, extremely vulnerable, manipulative, traumatized, and who may or may not be capable of that change. And so what I try to show in the chapter is that notions of dangerousness are shaped by those different legal, institutional and different professional understandings of risk, and try to expose the uncertainties and complexities at the heart of that. So how did that translate into evidence? Well, essentially what all the theoretical kind of material, and I think what was quite clear to me after going through the process of the research was that there's a lack of clarity about what the OLR is, and there's a lack of clarity about the OLR group and about their needs maybe not so much about their risks, but certainly about their needs and about what the purpose and function of the order for lifelong restriction is. Is it what Lord Maclean and his committee set out, or is it something different? And those are reflected within recommendations 1, 4, and 5. I think that says there. So 1 recommendation to clarify the purpose of the OLR, and I know that the RMA have worked extremely hard to do this, but I think the evidence speaks for itself in that there's still that lack of clarity about what the purpose of it actually is. Chapter 6 is about the fear and anxiety and about that comes with managing a group of dangerous persons. And the chapter really delves into the emotional dimensions of risk work and argues that managing the OLR is not simply technical and it's not simply administrative, although it is a lot of it is about the administrative elements of it, but that actually risk management is a profoundly human task, and it examines how the responsibility for preventing future harm and making decisions under conditions of uncertainty and operating within highly scrutinised risk environments shapes the emotional lives of practitioners. And in doing that, the chapter argues that risk government produces its own forms of fear and anxiety and vulnerability for practitioners, thus extending the consequences of the order for lifelong restriction beyond those upon whom it's imposed into those who are responsible for administering it. And the evidence that if I reduce it to evidence, it's about, fear of, if I make the wrong decision, what's going to happen? What are the consequences of that going to be? It could be arrest a member of the public, as conveyed throughout the thesis. It could be a professional risk to the self. And that is reflected in recommendation 6, which is really about the enhancement of practitioner support and decision-making capacity when we're dealing with high-risk persons. Chapter 7, this was in many ways one of my favourite chapters because it was really about the lack of hope that a person might feel when they're subject to an indeterminate sentence with no end, but also exploring hope or hopelessness and the symbolic marking of a person as dangerousness, and how practitioners really, really struggle with support and with supporting people through a sentence and helping them to manage their sentence through that process. So it shows in many ways how that kind of confinement and that hopelessness bleeds from the condemned subject into those that are responsible for caring and supporting them. And the recommendations for that are reflected in 3, 4, 7, and 8. And that is one of the recommendations which might be slightly controversial in respect of my last chapter here, was the potential for introducing an OLR review tribunal to try to make the system a bit fairer than it actually is. Also, number 4 was to improve access to rehabilitation and progression. And for anybody that knows a wee bit about the order for lifelong restriction, and from what I've said earlier about the 92% of persons who are past the punishment part of their sentence, they are having real issues accessing rehabilitation within programmes within prison, and also navigating the complex progression process. In terms of number 7 and 8, would be my recommendations were to safeguard human rights compliance, and that links to potentially to the tribunal, but also to other aspects, and to monitor the psychological well-being of persons subject to the order for lifelong restriction. And the last chapter was really about the internal logics of the OLR as a bureaucratic system of risk government, and argues that the kind of pursuit of certainty through increasingly bureaucratic procedures, documentation and audit, and really the ramping up of that bureaucratic process, is actually becoming detached from the stated aims of rehabilitation and progression, which of course underpin our prison system. So by exploring practitioners' experiences of administering the system, the chapter discusses how bureaucratic processes generate their own forms of complexity and uncertainty and institutional contradiction, and ultimately a questioning of whether or not the machinery of risk is really serving the people that it intends to govern. And so taking that into evidence and to recommendations is really about, there's a need to review sentence management processes, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And then there is recommendation 4, which is again about improving access to rehabilitation and progression for people subject to orders for lifelong restriction. Could you please flip to the next? Yeah, exactly. So that's my list of policy recommendations there, but they're in the briefing. And just the last one, I think, is just my references. So just to say that the process itself was extremely rewarding. I had a great mentor. It was very, very difficult for me to move from the kind of thesis that I'd been embedded in for so long, and to try to reduce it down without losing any of the nuance and importance into the policy briefing, but nonetheless an extremely important experience, actually, and would like to say thank you so much to SCCJR and Karen for her support in this process as well. That's me.
Thanks, Nicola. Such an important topic, and like so much to think about there in terms of how we define risk and how we think about it in terms of risk for whom, and the gulf sometimes between intended consequences and unintended consequences and the practicalities of administering initiatives, particularly on the practitioners who it falls to administer those schemes. I find that an especially interesting element, so thank you. Okay, so on to our last speaker, Ülkü, sort of last but certainly not least. So Ülkü carried out her PhD in Glasgow, focusing on gender-based violence in rural areas in Scotland. And Ülkü was supervised by Souhami in Edinburgh University. Now, we did have a technical issue with Ülkü's audio earlier on, but let's hope that's resolved. So over to you, Ülkü, and hopefully we can hear you now.
Thank you, Una and Karen. The brief actually is based on my PhD research at the University of Glasgow, which examined gender-based violence in rural and islands communities in Scotland. The starting point for my research was a deceptively simple question: how does rurality shape experiences of gender-based violence, help seeking, access to support, and service provision? In other words, what changes when violence is experienced not only within a relationship or household, but within a particular spatial, economic, social, and cultural conditions of rural life? As you know, Scotland has established an ambitious and progressive framework for addressing gender-based violence, particularly through Equally Safe. However, my research shows that these commitments cannot be delivered equitably if rural realities remain marginal within policy design, funding, and service provision. That is the actually central argument of the policy brief. My PhD study, drew on qualitative in-depth interviews with women who had experienced gender-based violence in rural Scotland, and with support service providers working in Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland groups and centres operating in rural areas of Scotland. Bringing these perspectives together was important because it allowed the research to examine both lived experiences of abuse and the practical realities of providing support across geographically dispersed communities. One of the main findings is that rurality is not just about geography and distance, although spatial dimensions are clearly important. Long travel times, limited public transport, high travel costs, poor weather, and restricted access to local specialist services can all make it harder for victim survivors to seek help, attend appointments, access justice processes, or leave abusive situations. But rurality is also social. In smaller communities, reduced anonymity, high visibility, and interconnected relationships can shape whether, when, and how women disclose abuse. Concerns about confidentiality can be particularly acute where service providers, police officers, health professionals, perpetrators, and wider family or community networks may be known to one another. This doesn't mean that rural communities are inherently unsafe or unsupportive. In fact, rural communities can also be places of solidarity, care, and informal support. But my research shows that the social closeness often associated with rural life can have complex and sometimes constraining effects for victim survivors. Rurality is also economic and material. Housing shortages, financial insecurity, limited employment opportunities, and dependence on shared transport and resources can all constrain women's options. These conditions may make it more difficult to leave an abusive relationship, relocate safely, access services confidentially, or rebuild life after abuse. A further important finding is that perpetrators can actively exploit these rural conditions. Isolation, limited mobility, dependence on shared resources, and concerns about community visibility can become part of coercive control. This means rurality shouldn't be understood simply as natural backdrop to abuse. It can shape both the conditions in which abuse is experienced and the strategies through which perpetrators maintain control. For me, one of the key challenges is developing the policy brief was translating a large, theoretically informed PhD into a short, accessible, and policy-facing document. The thesis allowed me to develop a detailed analysis of rural space, feminist intersectionality, coercive control, and wider structural conditions shaping women's life. A policy brief requires a different kind of writing. So the task was therefore not simply to summarize the thesis or reduce its length. It was to translate the research into a clearer policy message that one-size-fits-all responses to gender-based violence risk reproducing unequal access to safety, support, and justice for victim survivors in rural and island communities. This also meant making difficult decisions about what to foreground in the policy brief. In the thesis, I could spend more time developing conceptual arguments and presenting empirical complexity. In the policy brief, I needed to identify the findings that speak most directly to policy and practice. Rural proofing, specialist support, sustainable funding, and coordinated place-based responses. So the first priority is rural proofing. By this, I mean that national gender-based violence commitments should be systematically assessed in terms of how they operate in rural and island context. Rural proofing shouldn't be an afterthought once policy has already been designed. It should be built into policy development, implementation, funding decisions, and evaluation. The second priority is improving access to specialist support. Victim survivors in rural and island communities need services that are specialist, confidential, and accessible. This may include mobile and outreach provision, safe and discreet access routes, support outside immediate local area where needed, and remote or digital options where these are appropriate, safe, and properly resourced. The third priority is sustainable funding for specialist provision. Services working in rural areas often face insecure funding, workforce pressures, high demands, and additional costs linked to geography and travel. Short-term funding arrangements can make it difficult to provide consistent long-term support. Sustainable investment is therefore essential if national commitments are to translate into meaningful support on the ground. The fourth priority is coordinated and place-based responses. Transport, housing, poverty, digital exclusion, and access to healthcare and justice are not separate from gender-based violence. They shape victim survivors' practical options for safety and support. Effective rural responses, therefore, require collaboration across specialist services, local authorities, health, housing, justice agencies, and the wider third sector. The central takeaway from the brief is that rurality must be treated as central to gender-based violence policy and practice, not as a peripheral issue. Rurality shapes the conditions in which abuse occurs, the barriers victim survivors face, the options available to them, and the resources required by services. If Scotland's national commitments are to be implemented equitably, policy and service models need to reflect the realities of life across rural and island communities. Access to safety, support, and justice shouldn't depend on where someone lives. And I would like to end by thanking SCCJR, my mentor, my supervisors, and especially to women and the practitioners who generously shared their experiences and insights with me. I hope this brief contributes to ongoing conversations about how Scotland can strengthen its response to gender-based violence and ensure that rural realities are fully recognized in policy, practice, and evaluation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ülkü. Again, such an interesting, important area of work, and one that I think is under-researched. And I think this focus on rurality, especially in Scotland, is quite surprising when you consider the geography of Scotland. So again, shining a light on something that really needs to be looked at, I think, in much more detail and understood, like you say, not just in terms of the policy response, but how also rurality actually shapes the experience of domestic abuse or violence against women more broadly. So we've come to the end of our 5 presentations. I mentioned that Andrea wasn't able to join, so I just wanted to flag and highlight her brief. It's a really interesting piece of work. The title actually, I think, kind of tells its own story. So the title is Telling My Story My Own Way, Improving the Experiences of Victims, Witnesses and the Accused in the Criminal Courts in Scotland. It's a really interesting piece of work, and I would really encourage you to take a look at that brief in Andrea's absence. Perhaps if we move to the next slide, Karen, we've got a QR code that you can use to access all of the policy briefs now, which have been uploaded to the SCCJR website. So I really would encourage you to follow that and take a look at the briefs in your own time. Just while people are kind of gathering their thoughts there, I should also say if there are particular questions that you have or you want to follow up with any one of our presenters, they're all very happy for you to reach out to them. If you have any difficulty in contacting them, you're also welcome to contact Karen Mabon, and she will be able to facilitate contact there as well. It's just been fantastic to hear not just about like the range of topics, but also about the process. That's really given me a lot of food for thought as a researcher myself, and also as a PhD supervisor, and reflecting back on my own PhD thesis, where I reached points in it where I think if someone had asked me what it was about, I don't think I could have explained it coherently. So I think the policy briefs really look fantastic. So congratulations to you all. Thanks so much for your presentations today, and thanks also to everyone for their attendance today and their attention and questions. Thank you.